What if I told you that one of the most sacred objects in all of human history never actually disappeared? What if, right now, at this very moment, it is sitting inside a small stone chapel in northeastern Africa, guarded by a single monk who has dedicated his entire life to one purpose, making sure no one gets close enough to touch it? We are talking about the Ark of the Covenant. If you grew up reading the Bible, or even if you just watched Indiana Jones as a kid, you have heard that name. The Ark of the Covenant is described in the Old Testament as the most holy object ever created. It carried the original 10 Commandments given directly by God to Moses on Mount Sinai. For centuries, it sat at the center of Israelite worship, inside the most sacred room of Solomon's Temple in Jerusalem. And then, at some point in history, it simply vanished. No confirmed record of where it went, no wreckage, no trace. Historians have debated its fate for over 2,000 years. But in Ethiopia, there is no debate. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church says they have it. They say they have always had it, and they say they will never let anyone see it. So the question is this: could one of the most important objects in the entire Bible actually be sitting in Africa right now? Stay with me, because this story is far stranger and far older than most people realize. Before we can understand why Ethiopia claims to have the Ark, we need to understand what the Ark actually was, not just as a religious symbol, but as a physical object described in remarkable detail in some of the oldest texts in human history. The story begins in the book of Exodus. According to Exodus, after God freed the Israelites from slavery in Egypt, Moses led them through the desert toward the Promised Land. During this journey, Moses climbed to the top of Mount Sinai and received 2 stone tablets inscribed with the 10 Commandments, the foundational laws of the Israelite faith. And God gave Moses detailed instructions for building a container specifically designed to carry and protect those tablets. That container was the Ark of the Covenant. The description in Exodus is surprisingly specific. The ark was built from acacia wood, a hard and durable timber found throughout the Middle East and Africa, and covered inside and out with pure gold. The dimensions were precise, roughly 4 feet long and 2.5 feet wide. Not a massive vault or a towering monument, something a small group of men could carry on their shoulders. On top of the ark sat a lid made of pure gold, called the mercy seat. On either side stood 2 golden figures, cherubim, a type of divine being described in Hebrew scripture, with wings stretching upward and inward, meeting over the center of the lid. According to the text, this space between the wings was where the presence of God would descend to communicate with Moses and the high priests of Israel. Think about what that means for a moment. The ark was not just a storage box for religious documents. It was understood to be the literal dwelling place of God on earth. The Israelites believed that wherever the ark went, the power of God traveled with it. When they crossed the Jordan River, the priests carried the ark ahead of the army. When Joshua led the siege of Jericho, the ark was carried around the city walls for 7 days before the battle began. This was not a decorative religious item. This was the most powerful and sacred object in the entire Israelite world. And when King Solomon finally built the Great Temple in Jerusalem around the 10th century BCE, the ark was placed in its innermost chamber, a room called the Holy of Holies, so sacred that only the high priest could enter it, and only once a year. So if this object was that sacred, that carefully protected, that central to an entire civilization, how on earth did it just disappear? To understand how the ark vanished, we need to travel to one of the most catastrophic moments in ancient Israelite history. The year is 586 BCE. A powerful Babylonian king named Nebuchadnezzar II has been expanding his empire across the ancient Near East. His armies are disciplined, his campaigns relentless, and Jerusalem, the sacred capital of the kingdom of Judah, is now directly in his path. After a prolonged siege, Nebuchadnezzar's forces breach the walls of the city. What follows is described in the Book of Kings and confirmed by archaeological evidence. The destruction is total. Solomon's temple, the magnificent structure that had stood at the heart of Jerusalem for centuries, is torn down. The city is burned. A significant portion of the Israelite population is taken captive and marched east to Babylon in what history calls the Babylonian exile. It is a defining trauma in Jewish history. And somewhere in the chaos of that destruction, the Ark of the Covenant disappears from the historical record. Now, pause here for a moment, because this is where things get genuinely mysterious. When Babylonian records describe the treasures taken from the temple, they mention gold and silver objects, temple vessels, and various sacred items. But the Ark is not specifically listed among the confirmed spoils of Babylon. It simply stops being mentioned. This silence has fueled debate for over 2,500 years, and historians have put forward several competing theories. The first is destruction. Perhaps the Ark was burned along with the temple. Wooden objects covered in gold would not necessarily survive a massive fire, and some scholars argue this is the most straightforward explanation. The second theory is capture. Perhaps Nebuchadnezzar's forces took the Ark as a trophy of war, and it eventually disappeared as Babylon itself later fell to Persia. The third theory is concealment. Some researchers have pointed to passages in Jewish and early Christian texts suggesting that priests, knowing the city was about to fall, may have hidden the Ark underground or moved it to a secret location before the city was taken. The Book of Maccabees, for example, contains a passage in which the prophet Jeremiah hides the Ark in a cave on Mount Nebo.
Here is where I want to hear from you in the comments. Which of these three theories do you find most convincing? Destroyed, captured, or hidden before the city fell? Drop your answer below because this debate is very much still alive among historians today. And then there is the fourth theory, the one that takes us all the way to Ethiopia. The Ethiopian explanation for what happened to the Ark does not begin with Nebuchadnezzar. It begins much earlier, centuries earlier, in a story that is one of the most remarkable in all of African history. To understand it, we need to go back to the reign of King Solomon himself. According to the Hebrew Bible, Solomon was the wisest and wealthiest king of ancient Israel, and his reputation for wisdom spread far beyond his borders. In one of the Bible's most intriguing passages, a queen from a distant southern land travels to Jerusalem to test Solomon's wisdom for herself. She is called, simply, the Queen of Sheba. The Bible gives us only a brief account of her visit. She arrives with great wealth, asks Solomon difficult questions, and departs impressed by his wisdom and prosperity. That is where the Hebrew Bible leaves the story. But the Ethiopian tradition takes it much further. In Ethiopia, the Queen of Sheba is known as Makeda, and according to Ethiopian tradition, her relationship with Solomon did not end with a diplomatic exchange. During her time in Jerusalem, Makeda and Solomon had a son together. That son's name was Menelik. Menelik grew up in Ethiopia with his mother, but when he was a young man, he made the long journey back to Jerusalem to meet his father. According to the Ethiopian account, Solomon welcomed Menelik warmly, recognized him as his son, educated him in the ways of Israel, and when the time came for Menelik to return home, Solomon sent a delegation of Israelite priests and nobles to accompany him. And this is where the Ethiopian legend makes its most extraordinary claim. During the night before Menelik's departure, a group of young Israelites who were part of his escort secretly entered the Holy of Holies. They removed the Ark of the Covenant, replaced it with a replica, and carried the real Ark with them as Menelik's party traveled south.
According to some versions of the story, when Menelik discovered what had happened, he interpreted the ark's departure from Israel as the will of God, a divine confirmation that his kingdom, Ethiopia, was now chosen to be the true guardian of God's covenant with humanity. This entire account is preserved in a text called the Kebra Nagast, which translates from the ancient Ge'ez language as the glory of kings. The Kebra Nagast is not a casual folk tale. It is a major sacred text of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, believed to have been compiled around the 14th century CE, though many scholars believe it preserves oral traditions that are far older. For many Ethiopians, the Kebra Nagast is not simply mythology, it is history. It is the story of how Ethiopia became a chosen nation, how the Ark arrived on African soil, and the story of a royal lineage, the Solomonic dynasty, that ruled Ethiopia for centuries and claimed direct descent from Solomon and Makeda themselves. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. This sounds like a powerful national legend, but is there any historical or archaeological support for it? That is exactly the right question, and it is one that historians are still working to answer. If the Ark of the Covenant is anywhere on earth, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church says it is here, Aksum, a city in the Tigray region of northern Ethiopia. Today, Aksum is a modest city of several 100,000 people, but 2,000 years ago it was one of the greatest cities in the ancient world. The Aksumite Empire, which flourished from roughly the 1st to the 7th centuries CE, was a major trading power whose merchants controlled key routes connecting the Mediterranean world to Arabia, India, and the interior of Africa. Aksum was not some isolated corner of the world. It was a sophisticated empire with its own writing system, its own coinage, monumental stone obelisks called stelae, rising over 20 meters into the sky, and active trade relationships with Rome, Persia, and India. When the Aksumite king Ezana converted to Christianity in the 4th century CE, Ethiopia became one of the first nations on earth to adopt Christianity as a state religion. This is important context because we are not talking about a tradition invented recently. We are talking about one of the oldest Christian civilizations on the planet. And at the heart of Aksum, there is a church. It is called the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion. The current building was constructed in the 17th century, but the church claims to stand on the site of a much older structure, traditionally said to have been built during the reign of King Ezana himself in the 4th century CE. According to Ethiopian tradition, this is where the Ark has been kept since Menelik brought it from Jerusalem. But here is what makes the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion unlike any other religious site in the world. Next to the main church building stands a small, separate chapel, simple, modest, unassuming from the outside. It is called the Chapel of the Tablet, and inside that chapel, according to the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, rests the Ark of the Covenant. The chapel is not open to the public. It is not open to priests, bishops, or even the patriarch of the Ethiopian Church. There is one person and only one person who is allowed inside. He is called the guardian of the Ark. The guardian is a monk, a single individual, chosen specifically to dedicate his life to this one purpose. Once a man is appointed guardian of the Ark, he never leaves the grounds of the chapel. He lives there, spends his days in prayer and fasting, and when he dies, a new guardian is chosen to take his place. The current guardian, in interviews conducted through intermediaries, has confirmed that the Ark is inside the chapel and described it as a sacred presence he is not able to fully look upon. But he will not allow anyone else to enter. No photographs, no examination of any kind. His role is not to prove the Ark exists. His role is to protect it. Now, I want to ask you something directly. If you were a historian or an archaeologist, and a single monk told you that one of the most important objects in human history was inside that locked chapel, but you were not allowed to look, how would you feel about that? Frustrated? Skeptical? Intrigued? Let me know in the comments, because this is one of the most genuine debates in the study of ancient history. The Ethiopian Church's position is essentially this: the Ark does not need to be verified by outsiders. Its existence is a matter of faith, guarded by tradition. And for millions of Ethiopian Christians, that is entirely sufficient. But for historians, archaeologists, and curious minds around the world, the question remains painfully and maddeningly open. Here is the fundamental problem at the heart of this entire story. There is no independent verification, no photograph, no scientific analysis, no outside witness who has entered the chapel of the tablet and confirmed with their own eyes that a specific ancient artifact is inside. The entire claim rests on the testimony of the guardian, the teachings of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and a tradition that stretches back through centuries of religious and cultural life. For archaeologists and historians trained in evidence-based methods, this presents an enormous challenge. One of the most prominent researchers to examine this question seriously was the British journalist and writer Graham Hancock, who spent years investigating the Ethiopian claim and wrote a detailed book on the subject in 1992. Hancock was granted more access to church authorities and local traditions than almost any outside researcher before him, and he came away genuinely uncertain. He concluded that while he could not confirm the Ark's presence, he also could not dismiss the Ethiopian tradition as simple mythology. Several respected scholars of ancient Semitic history have noted something interesting. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church preserves traditions and practices that appear to reflect very early Jewish influence, dating back well before the Common Era. Ethiopian churches, for example, observe certain Sabbath practices and dietary laws that closely parallel ancient Jewish law. This does not prove the Ark is in Aksum, but it does suggest that the connection between ancient Ethiopia and ancient Israel may be more historically grounded than casual observers might assume. Some historians have pointed to archaeological evidence suggesting that a Jewish or proto-Jewish community may have existed in the region of ancient Ethiopia in the centuries before and after the Babylonian exile. If such a community existed, it opens the possibility, just a possibility, that religious objects or traditions from Jerusalem could have made their way to East Africa in the ancient world. Scholars are careful to separate possibility from proof, and the honest answer, as of today, is that without access to the chapel of the tablet, there is simply no way to determine what is or is not inside. The Ethiopian Church has made it clear they will not grant that access, and this has led to two very different reactions in the academic world. Some historians treat the claim with respectful skepticism, acknowledging the sincerity of Ethiopian tradition, while noting that without evidence, the claim cannot be accepted as historical fact. Others argue that the Ethiopian Orthodox Church's refusal to allow examination is itself consistent with how such a profoundly sacred object would be treated by a community that genuinely believes it possesses something divine. After all, the original Ark in the Bible was also off-limits. You did not just walk up to it and look inside. So which interpretation makes more sense to you? Is the secrecy a sign that there is nothing to see, or is it a sign that the tradition is being taken with absolute seriousness? This is genuinely one of the most fascinating open questions in the field of religious history, and I would love to hear where you land on it. Even if we set aside the question of whether the Ark is actually in Aksum, the Ethiopian claim matters deeply, for reasons that go well beyond treasure hunting or biblical mystery. For most of recorded history, the dominant narratives of ancient civilization have been told from the perspective of Europe and the Middle East. Egypt gets discussed extensively. Greece and Rome dominate the textbooks. Mesopotamia, Persia, the Levant. Africa, with the exception of Egypt, has often been treated in popular history as a backdrop, a trading partner, a destination for explorers, a place where great things happened to other civilizations. The Ethiopian Ark tradition pushes back against that framing completely. It says Africa was not just a recipient of history. Africa was at the center of one of the most significant stories in all of human religion. The Kebra Nagast does not describe Ethiopia as a minor kingdom that received a cast-off relic. It describes Ethiopia as the chosen nation, the rightful guardian of God's covenant with humanity. This narrative gave the Ethiopian people, and the Aksumite civilization in particular, a profound sense of sacred identity that shaped their culture, their politics, and their faith for over 1,000 years. And Aksum deserves to be understood on its own terms. At its height, the Aksumite Empire was listed by a Persian writer of the 3rd century CE as one of the 4 greatest kingdoms in the world, alongside Rome, Persia, and China. Its monumental stone obelisks still stand in Aksum today, and the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, founded in the 4th century, is one of the oldest continuous Christian institutions in the world, predating the adoption of Christianity by many European nations. When we talk about the Ark of the Covenant in Ethiopia, we are not talking about a legend grafted onto a simple culture. We are talking about a story embedded in the history of one of the ancient world's most sophisticated and powerful civilizations. Scholars of African history, of ancient Semitic religions, and of the Hebrew Bible have increasingly recognized that the connections between ancient Israel and ancient East Africa are real, documented, and genuinely worth studying. The Ark story, whatever its ultimate truth, is a window into a history that most people in the West have never been taught, and that, in itself, makes it worth knowing. So here is where we land. The Ark of the Covenant is one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in the history of human religion. It was the most sacred object in ancient Israelite civilization, believed to carry the very presence of God. And at some point between the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BCE and the pages of history that follow, it vanished from the record. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church says it did not vanish. They say it traveled south, carried by a young man named Menelik across the ancient world to Aksum, where it has been guarded ever since by a single monk inside a small stone chapel that no outsider is permitted to enter. If the Ethiopian tradition is correct, then one of the most important objects in the entire Bible is still here, still whole, still existing in the physical world, 2,500 years after Jerusalem fell. And if it is not, then this story still tells us something extraordinary about the power of faith, of tradition, and of a people who kept a sacred identity alive across millennia. Either way, the story of the Ark in Ethiopia is one of the most compelling chapters in the long and largely untold history of Africa. So I leave you with this final question. Do you think the Ark of the Covenant is actually in Ethiopia, or has it been lost to history forever? Tell me what you think in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you want more stories like this, ancient mysteries, forgotten civilizations, and the history they never taught you in school, make sure you subscribe because we are just getting started.